And Sandy Hervieux. Oh, there we go. Sandy is a virtual reference coordinator and liaison librarian at McGill University, as well as the ABQLA past president. Winter is a graduate student reference assistant and a Master's of Information Studies candidate at McGill University. And Sarah is also a graduate student reference assistant and a Master of Information Studies candidate at McGill University. So I hope you enjoy your presentation today with our three speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Kelly, for this great introduction. So thank you for coming to our talk, Curiouser and Curiouser, how the pandemic has impacted reference services. So we will start by kind of adding on to our introductions. If there's anything you want to add, Winter and Sarah, go right ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Winter Royce-Roll, and I'm one of the graduate student reference assistants here at McGill Library.
I'm Sarah Wood-Gagnon. I'm also one of the graduate reference assistants, and I'm just finished my first year, and Winter just graduated.
Right, and I'm Sandy, and I'm the virtual reference coordinator and also a liaison librarian at McGill. So to give you a bit of context, Winter and Sarah have been really instrumental in the last year in helping us provide reference services, both in person and online. And I was their direct supervisor, and we decided to kind of put together this presentation to tell you a little bit more about some of the things we noticed during and kind of still happening pandemic with regards to reference. So Winter's going to tell us a little bit more about what we are going to cover today.
So for today, we're going to be covering the literature review that we conducted. We'll jump right into the institutional context at McGill Library. We'll go into in-person reference during COVID-19, as well as virtual reference during COVID. We'll round it off with student perspectives, so myself and Sarah, and then we'll finish it with the practical implications and best practices for the research that we've done and the future direction of research. Next slide, please. So when we started conducting the literature review, we found several commonalities across all of the various studies. So the first one that we wanted to make note of was that virtual reference overall has increased during the pandemic. And this is in part because a lot of the libraries had to limit physical space and close at the beginning of the pandemic. So a lot of these studies started comparing pre-pandemic virtual reference to pandemic virtual reference. And they found that the number of reference interactions through either chat, text, virtual consultations, all of those increased dramatically during the pandemic years. So for example, one study found that virtual reference questions increased 324% in the summer months of when you compared it from 2019 to summer 2020. And then again, when we compare semesters, a study found that there was a 70% increase from the fall semester in 2019 to the fall semester in 2020. And that 70% increase was for virtual reference questions. And again, for one last example, other studies found that even when you compare the pandemic year of 2020 to 2021 to the second highest comparable year of 2014, 2015 for one library, there is a 12% increase in those virtual reference questions when you compared the two. So that was just something to make note of. A lot of these studies found that the increase during the pandemic in virtual reference questions was very significant to the degrees that I just mentioned. And while the sheer number of virtual reference questions increased, the types of questions and how they were answered also changed. So librarians noticed that virtual reference questions were becoming more complex. A lot of them noted that these questions on VR required multiple resources to answer in comparison to in-person reference questions prior to the pandemic. So not only did the complexity of these questions increase, but the length of time increased as well as people were adjusting to VR. Although, even though the length of time to answer these VR questions increased, it doesn't really account for the wait times for responses or any connectivity issues that people might have had. So on to our next point for the literature review with issues in VR and the pandemic. The literature review revealed that there were several issues with VR during the pandemic. And the first was just that the pandemic halted existing advancements in reference trends like roaming reference, but it also was able to expand and advance existing trends like VR and asynchronous learning. And the pandemic also exposed some of the inequality to accessing learning materials like print reserves and textbooks. So it just exposed some of the issues that came with everything having to be online. And studies also found that many libraries experienced increased workloads, and there were very few studies that had formal work policies for remote schedules. So many librarians noted that they were working more from home. And virtual reference was also noted as being more labor intensive, and that there were also technological issues like internet connectivity problems that proved to be pretty challenging overall. So I guess that brings us to the next point, which is this explores how library adaptation, or how the libraries adapted to meet the demands of virtual reference service. So when we were doing the literature review, we found that some universities expanded to offer 24/7 virtual reference. And this was to accommodate students in different time zones. And they found that by switching to 24/7 service, that they actually were able to cover more chats during the pandemic compared to chats in 2019. But in order to staff the 24/7 service, they had to have more people from across different library departments help staff these chat schedules. And it also included hiring more student employees. And then there was also an attempt to improve the work-life balance and to divide the labor between part-time and full-time staff in order to accommodate these changes in work schedules. So one other adaptation that some universities implemented, and it was implemented here at McGill, was to add Zoom integration for the chats, which gave users the option to speak face-to-face with the librarian if there was a more complex reference question. Now I'll hand off the rest of the literature review to Sarah.
Hi guys. So overall, user experiences of VR are user experience is quite high. That's from previous literature studying it and from literature produced during the pandemic. It's high regardless of whether questions are being answered by a student assistant or a librarian, but users are found to still prefer in-person interaction overall. A notable point too is that users are quick to drop a chat if there's a short delay, compared to being more patient pre-pandemic. So that might just be from increased stress levels, and canned messages like just, one moment I'm helping someone else, have been found to, reduce delay time in people dropping the chats. So also too, one study found that more undergraduates during the pandemic experienced using library consultation services than before the pandemic, and they were more likely to recommend these services to other students during the pandemic. So that's good. So that means that like workshops and library services, like one-on-one consultations with liaison librarians, were being used and enjoyed by undergrads who previously didn't use them. In regards to challenges and implications, one study assumed that VR would change during the pandemic, but this was found to be false. The percentages were fairly similar comparing pandemic years to pre-pandemic years. This may be because VR was offered before the pandemic and well marketed, so pre-pandemic users were well aware of this service. There were significant differences in a request for branch information. So I guess people trying to find like quick information about like library opening hours and stuff during the pandemic with like rapid changing policies. But only a slight increase in overall questions in October and November, which are typically busy reference months anyways. Another study found that in 2018, more graduates than undergraduates used both the physical library and the online library, whereas more undergraduates than graduates used only the physical library. So the same study that surveyed students in 2021 found that more undergraduates never visited the library than graduates, and more graduates use only the online library. The same study found that students not using the online library increased from 23.2% in 2018 to 29.2% in 2021, and student use of neither the physical nor the online library increased from 4.4 to 21.3%. So libraries have also begun to receive a wider variety of questions concerning other library services. So like the bookstore or disability services or the writing center. And another study mentioned too that there was an increase of more like odd questions. So like people like asking like the measurement of something, or just like, I don't know, sometimes like even just like casual chats too. There was also too, in a recent systematic review of library services and provisions during COVID-19, I found that libraries are now engaging in welfare services and reaching out to their patrons, as well as providing resources that will help sustain the mental health and well-being of library users. So that's something that's been picked up as well too. And another study mentioned that permanent changes may be more internal versus external. So basically like how staff approach their work is more likely to have a greater long-term impact. So maybe incorporating some of these welfare services, and then also to I think too, making sure that people attend the library, because another survey noted too that there was like an alarm at the low volume of chats compared to the usual foot traffic that was in the library. So further research could be involving, studying why, like how the pandemic affected frequency of library use, and also which reference services are preferred. A recent 2020 study from McGill showed that students prefer the chat service over email because they find it quicker. They do like the quickness of of chat and VR services, and we do text as well too at McGill. And then do students prefer to email liaison librarians directly, or are they okay with sending it to a generic library email? And that's about it.
Okay, that moves on to reference at McGill pre-pandemic. So before the pandemic at McGill, we offered in-person reference at the Humanities and Social Sciences Library. And that was Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. McGill also offered virtual reference, which featured chat, email, text messaging, and virtual reference had been implemented since the early to mid 2000s here at McGill. And that was offered Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 5 a.m. And it was staffed by librarians and also reference assistants. So these reference services, both in person and virtual, were available to members of the McGill community, as well as members of the general public. And for the McGill community, even though the service was featured for the humanities and social sciences libraries, students from every discipline, every faculty were able to use this and ask their questions. One of the interesting things is that because virtual reference was implemented early on, it showed that the stats showed that there was a steady increase of virtual reference questions leading up to the pandemic. So those changes, those increases were happening at a steady pace. Next slide. Okay, and then during the pandemic, reference changed a little bit. So one dramatic change was that in-person reference stopped completely from mid-March to August 2021. So the only reference that was available was VR services, and through VR, it led to increased hours and staffing, different implementations of tools to provide the screen service, like the screen sharing, the embedded Zoom, and canned messages, features like that to help it move along a little better. And during the pandemic, virtual reference was staffed by the librarians. Next slide.
All right, so I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're seeing here. So much like Sarah and Winter mentioned in the literature review, where we looked at a lot of different institutions that offered reference during the pandemic, and we have all of those references in the bibliography slide at the end, so you can consult it. We saw a dramatic increase of virtual reference questions during the pandemic. Again, because the desk was closed, right? Our main desk at the Humanities and Social Sciences Library, where people from all disciplines came, but also individual desks in the branches, like the law library, the music library, those were all closed. So everyone turned to the virtual reference service, which is staffed by librarians in all the different disciplines. So that's very helpful when we get questions on standards and patents for us humanities and social sciences librarians. And you can see here like a dramatic increase. So the first column, the kind of lighter blue, is 2019, and then the green one is 2020. And the darker blue, I mean, is 2020, and then 2021 is the green one. So you can see very clearly, if we look at March, which yes, sometimes is quite busy because it's, you know, midterms, people are working on their papers. So we do see like a spike in reference questions. You can see that it went like, it went really, really high, really, really quickly. I think we got over 800 questions, which is more than we'd ever had before. And you can see that that pattern keeps up, right? Especially when you get to September of 2020, right? When school was back, but still online. So still a very much high increase of questions. So it's interesting because a lot of these big spikes correspond with when the library was closed, right? So in September, October, when everyone is starting the new school year, which is when even in person, we get a lot of questions. Now we saw them coming through virtual reference a lot more. You can also see a major spike in January 2021 because the library was closed for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, right? Because there was a spike in Omicron cases. So I think the library only opened physically on January 24th. So you can see an influx of people coming in asking like, what's happening? What are the services available to me? So it's been really interesting. And you can also see that mirrored. So the previous slide was virtual reference through all methods because we get questions on live chat, which is synchronous. We get emails and we also get texts. So that encompassed all of those. This is just for chat, which as Sarah mentioned is pretty much the most preferred method, but also the most popular one. So you can see that it very much mirrors the previous results where people turn to chat to get assistance before, but particularly during the pandemic, particularly at, really important times of the year, like September, October, when people are starting, and when the library was closed because of COVID closures. So it's really interesting. Now, as you can see, those are really outliers from that kind of steady increase we've had in the past. So now what will be interesting to see is how is the situation now going to affect chat and VR long-term, right? Are patrons going to turn to it more now that they've used it more in the past? That'll be something interesting to look at. And I think now we'll hear a little bit more about what happened with the in-person side of things.
Okay, so in-person reference was resumed in fall 2021, and that was from Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And it was staffed by librarians and me and Winter. We needed vaccine passports in order to enter the library until March 2022. And also you needed your McGill ID until March 2022, just because the library was still just open to the McGill community. There were checking this at the door, and there were also, they provided in the library and other locations FastPass stickers so that you could just show your McGill ID and you wouldn't have to have your vaccine passport scanned. So, next slide. Okay, so this is a comparison of reference questions received in person and on virtual reference here. And you can see like virtual reference has remained like quite steady, basically. There were more in-person questions in September when we came back in the desk, right? Because I think people were sort of happy to be out of their houses too. And then there was a switch to more virtual reference questions. Yeah, like, so I just find what's interesting about this is just virtual reference is always steady and there's more steep differences in numbers for in person as well. So you can go to the next slide and Sandy will go in more depth.
Yes, so like I mentioned previously, so this is a chart to show you exactly which method of communication people are using, right? Because if they're coming in person at the desk, they're coming in person at the desk. But for VR, they can use chat, they can use email, they can also use texting. So as you can see, chat is by far the most popular method to contact the library throughout. Although I have to say that in the past few years, we've also seen people be a little bit more willing to try and contact us by texting. I think just because students are probably used to texting everything now. So it's really interesting to kind of see that, like Sarah mentioned, that it's still, our numbers are still steady. There's been a big drop if you compare to when we were completely closed, but comparing to, regular years, VR is very steady in how much it's being used by people. And something I wanted to look at was not just how many more questions we're getting or how many questions we're getting in person versus on the desk, but what exactly are those questions? Like, what are people asking when they come to the desk at the McGill Library and talk to people versus what are the questions that they're asking on chat? Are those different? Are those the same? What do people use those services for? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about like further avenues of investigation. But these are just some stats that our great assessment librarian, Giovanna, put together and shared with me. So at the desk, we have a sheet that we've had ever since we've been back in person. So ever since the fall, we've tracked every single question that has come into the library and what type of question that was. Now, I would have liked to see what it was like before the pandemic, but we kind of collected stats a little bit different before then. So I can't do a one-to-one comparison. So I'd have to just go forward from now and see how those change. But you can see that the vast majority of questions that we get at the reference desk are directional questions, right? So it's people that are looking for the stapler, looking for the printers, looking for the washrooms. The study rooms are also very popular, right? And that makes sense because if you think about it, we not only had one cohort of new students, we had kind of two, because the people that started in 2020 had never been on campus physically. So they didn't know where things were, right? They were not traditional returning students. So I think it would have been interesting to see if that's the same as what we get usually, or if it's a little bit more because of that kind of additional need to know that information, but that could be a reason to explain it. But also there's big buildings and McGill has multiple buildings called the same thing. So it's very confusing for people. And then you can see the breakdown into kind of a little bit different types of questions. So your basic questions, which would kind of be, I'm gonna answer this. Were stats percentages recording for who is asking the reference question? No, we didn't keep track of who was asking the questions. It was more like, what are the types of questions, kind of difficulty related as well. But they were not, it was just like really like a tick on the sheet, right? To get a sense of what we're getting. But it would be interesting to see who's using the service, right? I can tell you right away, just from like anecdotal evidence, and I'm sure Sarah and Winter can share the same, that before March, when we were open to just the McGill community, we would get only McGill students and faculty, right? Because the general McGill population cannot come in, right? So those very much were just McGill. And then when we started from March to April, and you see this graph is from September to April, then we got members of the general community, and they tend to have very different questions, right? Like more alumni borrowing, community borrowing, that sort of thing. It's a little bit less reference, more how can I borrow books a little bit. But that would be an interesting thing to look at in the future. Okay, so like I mentioned, mostly directional, and then we move into some of the basic and intermediate questions. Basic is kind of your traditional known item search, like I'm looking for this book. That's usually what we kind of consider as basic. And then intermediate advanced are more like a little bit more involved reference questions where you have to take people to kind of a database or walk them through a research process. Technical are very much like technical issues, policies, 3%, and then the little orange, sorry about that. The little orange sliver that you see here are citation management softwares. So people who are using EndNote and Zotero to make bibliographies. So, so that's for the desk. So far what we've had in 2021, 2022. Now for VR, we've done quite a few studies of McGill that look in very much detail the types of questions and the difficulty levels of questions that people ask, because we have the the chat transcript, right? Like we have the entire record of the interaction. So it makes it easy to tell, okay, what, you know, who this person is, because sometimes when they come to the desk, they're not going to tell you if they're undergrad, grad, postgrad, faculty, right? And you can't really assume these things because, well, you never know, right? But on VR, it's very easy to kind of isolate those and really see how the entire conversation progressed, right? So the coding scheme that I've used in the past is a lot more detailed, as you can see, than the desk where it was just like basic, intermediate, and so on and so forth. But you can see that the types of questions are very different, right? Because there's not really directionals on chat. There are in the sense of like, if you look at that branch information, right? That's where your directional questions would be, but also anything related to library, right? Like, is the library open? What are the hours? Where are the study rooms? Can I book them? Like those would fall under that. So you can see it's a much smaller percentage. And meanwhile, like the known items, which were kind of that basic search, are much higher at 25%. And those reference questions are also a lot higher, right? So we somewhat see preliminarily that people ask different things. But to have like a conclusive look at it, like we'd have to use the same coding scheme and then code the same years, possibly not in a pandemic because that kind of skews your results a little bit, to see what people are really using each service for. And that's what I'm really interested in seeing is do people use them for different things, right? And there's value in that and knowing that. But just to give you a sense of how things have changed. So this is before the pandemic, typical year at McGill, what people were asking in the fall. This is during the pandemic. So as Sarah mentioned, some studies, including mine, thought that there would be a lot of changes, and turns out I was proven wrong. There were not a lot of changes. There were a lot more questions, like double the amount of questions, but people were still kind of asking the same things. At least on reference on VR. The major differences is that they were asking slightly more reference questions, which kind of makes sense because they couldn't go to the desk, ask someone how to do a lib review, right? So they turned to chat for that. And we had a lot more questions about the branches, right? The physical libraries themselves, because again, people were asking like, is it open? Can I book a study spot? Like in the fall of 2020, the library was not fully open, but students with their IDs could book a study space that was properly distanced from everyone else. So there were a lot of questions about that, right? So again, maybe not a traditional year, but gives you a sense of what people are asking about. All right, so some implications in future directions.
Okay, so because Sarah and I didn't work at McGill pre-pandemic, we can't really compare our experiences to the way that reference was conducted before. But after doing the literature review, we found that we could actually relate our experiences to some of the phenomenons that occurred in the literature. So one thing that we noticed was that the virtual reference questions were actually more complex than the in-person reference. So that was mentioned in the literature review and a little bit in the graphs that Sandy showed us, where VR, there was a slight increase in the types of questions for reference. And because a lot of the in-person questions were directional by nature, that meant that VR was getting fewer directional questions, so therefore there were more reference questions. And like the literature said, a lot of the VR questions required multiple resources and were a little more time consuming than someone coming to the desk and just asking for a book or asking for directions. The next point was that there were some technological difficulties with doing VR. So oftentimes there were internet connectivity problems, either on the end from us at McGill or on the end of the patron. So sometimes the connection would be cut off, the chat would be disconnected, and then a few minutes later, the same patron would come back and we'd resume our reference session. But that was just one difficulty that occurred a few times. And the other one was just the general access to e-resources, which also went along with the internet connection. And the other thing that we did not find in the literature, but we both experienced, was that for in-person reference, a lot of the phone calls that we got were actually longer than it would have taken to just answer their reference question. So what I mean by that is that when people would call the desk to ask their reference question, they would want to stay on the phone and talk a little more afterward, and it wouldn't have anything to do with the reference. Sometimes it was like, oh, the ski slopes are still open, or, you know, today I'm gonna bake this thing for a party I'm going to. So we found that with the in-person reference, sometimes it wasn't about asking the reference question or getting that response. It was actually just to have someone to talk to and have someone to connect to, which we think was very interesting. And it's something that the other studies, when we did our literature review, didn't really go into, but it's important nonetheless.
Yeah, I just to echo the last thing that Winter mentioned too, of people sort of reaching out for a connection during the pandemic. Before I came to McGill in fall 2021, I did work for another university, and I also worked in a call center for the Ministry of Advanced Education in another province. And I noticed the same thing too. There, that just like students and everything, they just wanted to kind of talk a little bit too, as well too. There was sort of that craving, that social aspect as well too. And another thing that was interesting between institutions was just that like the teamwork, because a lot of the time people were working virtually too. There was sort of a different dynamic. Instead of just running to people's offices to ask questions, there's always like a group chat on a certain platform opened, which is kind of nice too, because then, you know, more people have their eyes on it as well too, and you get more perspectives. And I find that too, for Winter and I as emerging professionals, that was really helpful too, to get many people's perspectives on questions as well too. We were also really nicely mentored by many different librarians at McGill too, from the different libraries who you know, took us over the basics of the different subjects and the kind of questions that we get, which was really helpful, except when we're panicking in chat about a really particular like question about like I don't know, the Bloomberg machine or something, which is like a management thing that's pretty specific. Anyways, I just think that this also goes hand in hand with sort of changing institutional mentalities about like how librarians go about VR. I think like this also came out in the literature too, that it's very much a teamwork kind of effort as well too. And I think like ironically, the pandemic sort of made it more of a teamwork effort too, like because instead of everyone in their individual offices, there was like a group chat as well too, where people could reach out and just learn a lot more too. I learned a lot from asking questions from the librarians. And I think also too, something that could be carried forward would be having more information and getting more involved with other aspects of the university, especially the writing center, because a lot of students come in with writing center questions or expectations that librarians will do writing center services as well too. So I also too, like at a previous university, I worked for a few years in the writing center as well too. And I think it's kind of heavily tied to library services, and it would be kind of, I think it would be kind of nice to have more collaboration between those two specifically. So that's the end of my little thing. Okay, so again, like I'm going to be reiterating some of the things that have been said and the implications that we found. There is the need to readjust staffing hours of reference services just because it's so popular. And I think too, I know Winter and I definitely benefited from our jobs as graduate reference assistants, but there've been studies at McGill too that say that reference assistants can provide high quality service as well too. And a lot of the questions that come in can be easily answered or just referred if they're higher level too. And it just, I think it speaks to that immediacy as well too, that someone at least has a response rather than sending an email into like the void and not knowing when they'll get an answer back, even if it's more in depth. Making sure that technology resources and platforms remain up to date and trying to, as much as possible, I suppose, reduce, issues with technology. Another thing is that user preferences can change and evolve. So, we've noticed though that user preferences seem to be quite steady for chat and favorable for VR, but just to continue to make sure they're taken into account. I think also something in regards to that too is like the slightly worrisome like statistic in that one study that showed that student use of neither the physical or the online library like drastically, like there was a drastic number of students that weren't using either. And so I think like that's something to be careful of. And maybe some things that would help with that is the importance of communication and human connection. So just making the students feel more, I suppose, more comfortable or more interested in coming to the library and using services, and liaising with other university resource centers to promote the library as well too, to students who might have been previously afraid or something to come in, or just not knowing what resources that we have.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Winter, for sharing your insights. Okay, so we've touched a little bit on this throughout the presentation, but what would be some future directions for research? What are some of the things that I'm thinking of looking at in the future? So like I mentioned, we've done quite a few studies that looked at the types and complexity of questions that we get on virtual reference. Again, because we have those transcripts of interactions, so it makes it very easy to tell, okay, what's the person asking? What's the complexity on the read scale or any other measurement tool? But I'd be really interested, like I mentioned, to look at the reference desk and see, okay, what types of questions are people asking in person? Are those different than the ones or VR? Are those complementary? Just to get a sense of what people want from those services. So then we can provide the best service if we know what users expect. And also be interested in looking at a longitudinal study to investigate the reference preferences and habits of users. Like my colleague, Tara Mawini, has done a lot of focus groups and interviews with users for the pandemic to see what they preferred in terms of virtual reference. But I'd be interested to see if that's going to change over time, right? The pandemic, a lot of studies mention that it's really accelerated online services and what people expect from online services, right? I know I engaged in a lot of online shopping during the pandemic, or like the whole movement for telemedicine or booking your vaccine appointments online, right? Which used to be a nightmare before. So is it because people now have access to that? Are they going to expect that more from us? Or is it the opposite and everyone's sick of screens and they want to see a person? So I'd be really interested in seeing, I don't think either of the services are going away. Like, I don't think that it's because VR is popular that you have to get rid of your reference desks. But I'd be interested in seeing how those services are going to change and what people are going to expect from them in the future. And like we've mentioned, like that's why having a continuous evaluation of those services and the user experiences, and also the experiences of the providers, right? Like how do they feel about these is going to be important going forward. So thank you all very much. If you have questions, we'd be happy to answer them. We've also put together the bibliography at the end. So thank you to Sarah and Winter for putting that there so you can access the articles if you want to learn more. But yes, we're happy to take any questions. So feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A feature, whatever is easiest. Yes, so Kelly has a great question about if the majority of in-person questions are directional, has better signage or library tours been considered? And yes, I think it's something that some librarians have pointed out before. It's also maybe a little, misleading because like I mentioned, a lot of people were new to the library and also it was closed to people who didn't have a vaccine passport for a while. So that may not be 100% representative of what we're normally getting. But yes, I think there's a renovation coming up of the main library in the next few years. And I think signage is something that's constantly been brought up because there's a lot of rooms, there's a lot of floors, there's 2 buildings connected with 2 different names. So yes, definitely something that's worth considering.
It also ties into like people's need for expediency as well too, because a lot of things too can be like Googled, but I think there's just like, if you just ask someone, you can find out in 2 seconds as well.
And I can answer the next question about providing 24/7 reference. So this was actually done at Cornell University, not at McGill. But from what I understand from the literature, they were able to collaborate with the different university campuses that they had. So Cornell has the main campus in Ithaca, New York. They have the medical school down in New York City. And they also have another campus located in the Middle East. So part of the reference was coordinating with those different campuses to provide that 24/7 service. But we didn't implement that here at McGill.
Quickly, because we have to leave the session for the next one. But someone's asking if the volume of reference questions changed over time. And yes, we've shown a few graphs where, while in person, it stopped because the library's been closed, right? And VR, it's like spiked incredibly, even though we'd already seen an increase over time before the pandemic. So it will be interesting to get a fuller view, hopefully post-pandemic, to really see how the trends have changed and emerged. Yeah. The increase of VR compensate for the loss of in-person. Again, before the pandemic, we did sampling. So they extrapolated numbers from sampling, which may not be, I can't do a one-to-one and tell you, I had this exact many questions in person versus this many in VR before the pandemic. So it makes it a little tricky to do that direct comparison between the two. But thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you very much to Winter and Sarah for co-presenting with me, and for Kelly for introducing us. So thank you.
Thank you everybody for coming. wonderful presentation. I learned a ton. I just wanted to thank all of those in attendance and any of you who are interested in hearing about the Lily Toth miniature book collection at the Jewish Public Library. Please stay aboard and we'll be starting that in just a couple of minutes.